In Lesson 5, we're going to be talking about how we can show subtracting numbers and subtracting positive and negative numbers, integers, using a number line and using the integer game. We're going to use the idea of discarding a card or taking a card out of your hand as a metaphor for subtracting. In example 2, we have two cards in our hand, 4 and 2, and I want to add them up, so I'm going to use a number line. 4 plus 2 is 6. We want to show that discarding or subtracting a positive card is the same as subtracting a positive number and will decrease the value of your hand. So if we were to take the 2 out of our hand, we're going to get 4 because we still have the 4 left. My score would decrease by 2 when I took this out of my hand. I can show that mathematically. 4 plus 2 minus 2, because I'm taking away the 2, gets me back 4. So taking away or subtracting the 2 causes my score to decrease by 2. Remember, decrease means get smaller. Let's take a look at this example two different ways. In this first section, here's my original example, 4 plus 2, and then I'm going to take away that 2. If I take away that arrow, I'm back to 4. Which leaves my answer at 4. Remember, we talked about how adding and subtracting the same number gets us back to our original number. Another way to look at this is if I put a negative 2 in my hand and took a look at my score. Here I have the 4 and the positive 2 and then the negative 2, and I'm back at 4 again. When we look at this, I started out with a total of 6 with the 4 and the 2. If I look at it two different ways, removing or subtracting a positive card changes the score in the same way as adding a card whose value is the additive inverse or opposite. Remember, additive inverse means a card that when you add it to another value, it gets you back to 0. So 2 plus negative 2 is the opposite or additive inverse of 2. Together these guys make 0, which is why I'm back at 4. If we look at, in this particular case, adding the corresponding negative value, which means 6 minus 2 is the same as 6 plus negative 2. I started out at 6 and then I subtracted 2, or I started out at 6 and I added negative 2. Two different ways to look at it. Let's take a look at another example. In this case, I'm going to be subtracting a negative number instead of a positive number. Here I have 4 plus negative 2. So there's my arrow for 4, and here's my arrow for negative 2, and I end up at 2. We want to look at how removing a negative card changes the score or value of the cards in my hand. If I were to discard or remove the negative 2, my score would increase by 2 because I would still have a 4 left in my hand. So 4 plus negative 2 minus the negative 2 gets me back to 4. If I take away or subtracting negative 2 causes my score to increase by 2. Let's look at this a little more closely. Here I have the same setup as before, but this time I've got 4 and negative 2. If I were to take away that negative 2, I'd go back to 4. Another way of looking at this is putting the opposite of negative 2 in my hand, adding 2 to my hand. So here's my 4, here's my negative 2, and then here's my positive 2. I'm back at 4 again. So two different ways of dealing with it, either subtracting or taking away, discarding my negative 2 card, takes me to a total of 4, or adding a card that is the opposite of negative 2 to my hand. If we want to fill out the work at the bottom, removing or subtracting a negative card changes the score in the same way as adding a card whose value is the additive inverse, remember that means opposite. In this case, adding the corresponding positive value, which means 4 plus negative 2 is the same as 4 plus 2. So 4 minus negative 2 is the same as 4 plus 2. All right, now that we've gone through all this, make sure your notes are up to date in your workbook. And in class, we're going to be playing the integer game and then taking a look and deeply how this can affect us with just numbers rather than pictures.